Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the second of 3 workshops exploring the idea of curating nation, a research project that I'm developing at UAL's Decolonising Arts Institute. Last week, we discussed what a national collection looks like. Today, we explore what stories of British art travel. Is it Downton Abbey we get to see, or the next series of small acts? Now, my name is Hammad Nasar. I'm a curator, strategic advisor, and principal research fellow here at the Decolonising Arts Institute. And these workshops are a collaboration between the Institute and the British Art Network's Black British Art Research Group. Chairing the workshop today will be my co-convener, Lizzie Robles.
Hi there, and thanks for the introduction, Hammad. My name is Lizzie Robles, and I'll be chairing today together with my co-leads. I lead the Black British Art Research Group, which is a part of the British Art Network. The series of workshops is supported by the British Art Network and the Decolonising Arts Institute at UAL. It's co-organized by the Black British Art Research Group, which again I co-lead with Alice and Marlene. Alice Correia and Marlene Smith, sorry. I didn't say that before. The Black British Art Research Group was founded in 2017 to bring together curators, artists, researchers, and academics interested in critical race issues as they pertain to the histories, collection, production, consumption, and display of art in Britain and its audiences. The British Art Network more broadly promotes curatorial research, practice, and theory in the field of British art. Their members include curators, academics, artist researchers, conservators, producers, and programmers at all stages of their professional lives. All are actively engaged in caring for, developing, and preserving British art, whether in museums, galleries, heritage settings, or art spaces, in published form or in educational settings across the UK and beyond. The network is comprised of research groups which focus on specific areas of British art, whose programs of activity, such as this series of workshops, are led and hosted by network members. And I think a link should be appearing imminently in the chat, where you can find more information about the British Art Network, including sort of how to join.
Now, this workshop series is the first public manifestation of the Curating Nation research project that I've been developing here as part of my fellowship at the Institute. Now, for those new to it, the UAL's Decolonising Art Institute has been conceived as a decentered, porous, and evolving space, which seeks to challenge colonial histories and imperial legacies and drive cultural, social, and institutional change. Now, it aims to do that through artistic, art historical, curatorial, museological, and pedagogic practice and research. Yet more links should be appearing in your chat, which will direct you to its research residency programs and its YouTube channel, where you can access recordings of a wide range of discursive events. Now, my Curating Nation project has come out of the past 15 years of curatorial and research projects in different shapes and sizes in different parts of the world. Almost all of them have been collaborative, and they have a shared investment in the construction and circulation of stories of nation. In Lines of Control, a long-term exhibition-led inquiry, we looked at the visual culture of partitions. Rock, Paper, Scissors was the National Pavilion of the UAE in Venice in 2017. In Hong Kong, we developed an action research-based course on Hong Kong's art history in collaboration with Hong Kong University and Asiad Archive. And with my Green Cardamom colleagues, Anita Dowd and Nada Raza, we collaborated with the literary magazine Granta on their Pakistan issue. More recently, when I was at the Stuart Hall Foundation, we started a project called Let Our Statues Speak, a pre-Colston attempt to bring difficult conversations around public monuments into the sphere of public cultures and school curriculums. Now, presently, alongside Curating Nation, I'm co-leading with Sarah Turner at the Paul Mellon Center, a project called London, Asia, which explores the entanglements of art histories between Britain and Asia. And for the next 18 months, as lead curator at the Herbert Art Gallery Museum during Coventry's year as the UK City of Culture, I will be curating the Turner Prize exhibition later this year and supporting a national collection-based exhibition co-curated with a local community group in 2022. So as you can see, these questions of nation and belonging are ones that constantly niggle. And today, these questions are being weaponized. So the Curating Nation workshops are an opportunity to think about these three questions in public with brilliant colleagues who've been wrestling with similar questions from different perspectives, as museum directors, curators, scholars, and artists. It is an inquiry rooted in practice around the question of agency to work in, but productively challenge the institutional constraints we all operate in. Now, before passing back to Lizzie to introduce today's workshop proper, I wanted to share one ongoing project as context. Now, the timing of these workshops was supposed to coincide with the first iteration of British Art Show 9 at Wolverhampton that I'm co-curating with Irene Aristasabal. The British Art Show, for those who don't know it, is the largest recurring exhibition of contemporary art in Britain, organized every 5 years by Hayward Gallery Touring. And we're going to give you a little glimpse as to what will follow. Now, we hope that will tempt you to come and see the British Art Show in its various guises in the 4 cities that host it. But what I wanted to sort of share with you is that this time round for British Art Show 9, we've conceived of the exhibition as a cumulative experience with different presentations across its 4 host cities. This allows us to present different combinations of work and artists responding to distinctive local contexts and the collection of the galleries that are hosting us. A number of artists will take advantage of this cumulative framework to develop projects over the course of the exhibition. Nearly half the artists will be making new works. In this way, we hope British Art Show 9 will test exhibitionary and touring models and allow possibilities for meaning to be co-created. Passing you back to you, Lizzie.
So just to give you a little bit of an idea of the shape of this first half of our workshop, we are shortly going to be hearing some opening statements from our invited panelists, who I'll introduce more fully in a moment. We have Emma Dexter, the Director for Visual Arts at the British Council, Roger Malbert, curator, writer, and former head of Hayward Touring, and Frances Morris, the director of Tate Modern. And they'll each be giving around a 5-minute opening statement centered on these sort of key questions that we're framing here today. And then we'll have a slightly longer response from the multidisciplinary artist Abbas Zaidi, followed by a longer period of discussion and questions. And again, I'm really hoping, and I think we're all, as organizers, all really hoping that that will be a time when we can all join in discussion with our panelists and our respondent. So I just wanted to set up a little bit of framing for this session. So as Hammad indicated, we're following on here from workshop 1 last week, in which we addressed the key question, what does a national collection look like? This week, we ask, what stories of British art travel? Which versions of British and British art are exported internationally and why? Which exhibitions tour and to which countries. If we accept that, as Tristram Hunt stated in 2018, the international collections across sites, national and international loan venues and touring locations of the V&A, whose context he was speaking of, but which is sort of, you could arguably apply this across museums and institutions. If they're tools of national soft power, how might we understand the stories that they seek to tell? Closer to home, we consider how exhibitions such as the British Art Show, which Hammad just introduced for us really nicely, respond to and are received by their various national, regional, and local contexts. We consider the role of national and international touring shows in the establishment and consolidation of a limited set of narratives of Britain and British art. And so I'd like now just to introduce our panelists for this session. Emma Dexter is Director of Visual Arts at the British Council. As the Commissioner of the British Pavilion at the Venice Biennale, Dexter is currently overseeing the commission for Sonia Boyce to represent the UK at the Biennale of Art 2022 in Venice. British Council exhibitions focus on collaboratively curated exhibitions centered on the British Council collection, such as Perceptions and the ongoing We Are Here program in collaboration with Lux and other global venues. Dexter started her career at the Potteries Museum, Stoke-on-Trent, before taking on curatorial and leadership roles at the Chisenhale Gallery in London, the ICA, Tate Modern, and Timothy Taylor Gallery. We're also joined by Roger Malbert, who's a writer and curator. He was, until July of 2018, head of Hayward Gallery touring at the South Bank Centre in London. He has organized and co-curated many exhibitions and written catalogue essays on artists including Tacita Dean, Michael Armitage, and Omar Ba. He is the author of Drawing People, The Human Figure in Contemporary Art, published by Thames and Hudson in 2015. Rounding out our panel is Frances Morris, the director of Tate Modern since 2016. Curator, writer, and broadcaster, Frances joined Tate in 1987, becoming head of displays at Tate Modern in 2000, and director of collections, international art from 2006. Alongside many exhibition projects and publications, including acclaimed retrospectives of Louise Bourgeois, Yaya Kusama, and Agnes Martin, Frances has led the transformation of Tate's international collection, strategically broadening and diversifying its international reach and representation, developing the collecting of live art and performance, and pioneering new forms of museum display. As indicated before, we all invited Abbas Zahedi to provide a response to the opening statements of our panelists. Abbas's interdisciplinary practice blends contemporary philosophy, poetics, and social dynamics with performance, sound, sculpture, and moving image. With an emphasis on how personal and collective histories interweave, he makes connections whenever possible with people involved in particular situations upon which he focuses to invite others into the conversation. So without further ado, and just to say that the full biographies, together with the longer program for today, are all available on the Eventbrite page for the workshop. So without further ado, I'd like to invite Emma. Would you like to kick us off?
Thank you very much, Lizzie. So yes, I'm going to kick off. I've chosen to talk about 3 different exhibitions, but just a few opening remarks as well. The British Council was founded in 1934 in response to the rise of fascism in Europe, and it was created to foster greater understanding between the United Kingdom and other countries. From the very beginning, it delivered arts programs such as international touring exhibitions of British art and taught English and promoted British education. The British Council collection came into being in 1938 because it was convenient to have easy access to its own works for its circulating exhibitions. It was also used for setting the scene for British culture within the council's buildings and teaching centres abroad, the first of which opened in 1938. For this reason, the collection has always been extremely pragmatic. It's been shaped by exhibition programme need. It's never attempted to be encyclopedic, and it has to be very practical to travel and be hung in unlikely places. Artists included in our collection or in our exhibitions don't have to be British or be born here. They should simply be or have been part of the art scene here. And so I'm going to base my opening statement on 3 exhibitions. The first one is Exhibition of Modern British Crafts, which went to the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York in 1942. The second one is Documentary Dilemmas, a photography exhibition that took place in 1993. And The Art of Dissonance, an exhibition at Seoul Museum of Art that took place in Korea in 2017. And I've chosen these examples because they're very different to each other. They're spread out across time, and they raise very distinct issues, which I hope address today's topic. But before I start, I want to say a really big thank you to Dr. Annabella Pollen, for whom I am indebted for much of the material that I'm going to share today, who is reader in History of Art and Design and director of the Centre for Design History at the University of Brighton. And I've drawn on research that she's done on the history of the British Council Fine Arts Department, its exhibitions and collection, for a forthcoming book entitled Art Without Frontiers. So I will be quoting at times from Annabella's work. So first of all, the Exhibition of Modern British Crafts at the Metropolitan Museum, 1942, consisted of table mats, silverware, wallpapers, embroidery, teacups, ashtrays, chests of drawers, and in cities across the USA and Canada. It's pretty plain that while the exhibition communicated notions around British identity based on the handmade and the traditional, as well as potentially stimulating trading opportunities, its main aim was to cultivate and maintain support for the war effort within the US, and was particularly targeted at reaching a broad mass audience, an audience that needed to continue to support the war and send troops to the war effort. And the exhibition opened only a few months after the US had officially joined the Allies. So audience engagement was really important to the appeal of the exhibition. Object handling by visitors was positively encouraged. At opening events, teacups were used from the exhibition to serve visitors with tea. Records played on record players behind the scenes, and there were even displays of dancing and singing and other live events that spontaneously took place in the exhibition spaces. And now I'm going to quote a few sections from Dr. Pollen's book describing the exhibition. In a series of interlocking rooms, staged as 3-sided sets, with tables laid for dinner and musical instruments strewn on the sofa, the exhibition of modern British crafts was styled as an ideal home. Every item from bookshelf to table mat was an exhibit, including the paper on the walls and the rugs on the floor, and tens of thousands flocked to see it on its 15-city tour. What made this show different from previous council exhibitions of oil paintings, however, was its appeal to a much wider cross-section of the public than those reached by exhibitions of paintings. So said Muriel Rose, the organizer. Showing domestic objects, pottery and glass, chairs and tables, books and textiles, particularly when grouped in arrangements suggesting rooms, does not present the barrier of strangeness many feel in regard to modern painting. And a collection of this kind is at once closely related to the daily life of visitors of every sort. Many museums noted that the record-breaking numbers of attendees were also not the audiences they usually attracted. Rose argued that the person who is less well informed about art and culture is also the type of person who is likely to be least informed and possibly the most prejudiced against Great Britain. The curator of the Museum of Fine Arts stated, "This exhibition stands for the kind of life we're fighting to preserve. It speaks a universal language." And as the director of Worcester Museum recognized, the exhibition's method was much more valuable than any direct form of propaganda. And that's the end of the quote. So I think it will be interesting to discuss that exhibition and its aims and achievements, and also the methods that it used, if we get a chance to later on. And then the second exhibition I wanted to briefly describe, Documentary Dilemmas, which took place between 1993 and 96, was subtitled Aspects of Documentary Practice in Britain, 1983 to 93, confounded some of the expectations that you might have regarding depictions of nationhood. And it took place in 21 locations across Brazil and Europe. So this exhibition contained Paul Graham's Troubled Land series on Northern Ireland and its landscape of historical lesions imprinted upon it. It contained Chris Killip's depictions of sea coalers on Northumberland's blasted shoreline, Jem Southam's poetic studies of detritus and mud, upsetting any expectations of what a British landscape might look like. It also looked at social lives and leisure, with Anna Fox's depictions of weekend war gamers, as well as Paul Rees's images of Britain as a living theme park museum of its own history. And I'm now quoting again from Dr. Pollen's book. I'm quoting an extract from a report in the British Council's staff magazine from the time on how Documentary Dilemmas was received in Sao Paulo. A life-size cardboard cutout of Margaret Thatcher spattered with red paint, a lone caravan parked on a deserted British beach in front of a rusting hulk of an abandoned trawler, a Union Jack caught in a solitary tree in a field in Northern Ireland. At the opening, an expatriate confronted the local representative. "They're not exactly promotional, are they? Can't the British Council show something a bit more attractive?" The visitor had wanted to know why there were no scenes, iconic scenic views of the Lake District. And that's the end of my quote. However, audience surveys from Brazil showed how much visitors appreciated the honesty and the exhibition went on to attract audiences across Brazil and Europe, including previously Eastern Bloc countries such as Poland, Czechoslovakia, and Romania.
That's really interesting.
So now, just coming on quickly to the last exhibition, just wanted
Sorry,
to
Emma, can I just make sure that we keep to time a bit?
Oh yeah, I've nearly finished. Yeah, just one.
Sorry.
The final exhibition I want to discuss didn't integrate local works, as we've now been doing in a lot of our exhibitions that were described by Lizzie earlier. But that's because the Korean curator very much wanted to explicitly explore British national identity. So the Art of Dissonance took place at Seoul Museum of Art as part of a UK-Korea bilateral season. And it was curated by Gya-hee Park and Claire Feely, based in London. A year after the Brexit referendum, Gya-hee Park wanted the exhibition to depict a nation in conversation with itself, which she felt spoke to audiences in Seoul. It addressed the UK's diverse narratives and histories, but also explored the role of debate, agency, protest, class and monarchy within democracy. The exhibition included John Akomfa's The Unfinished Conversation, Jeremy Deller and Alan Kane's Folk Archive, Rabina Hamid's paintings of voters and Toussaint Louverture, and alongside union banners created by Ed Hall. They also commissioned an alternative exhibition guide to the official labels and commissioned a public programme that examined parallel histories of political protest and artistic movements in Korea and the UK, respectively. In the words of the curators, the exhibition was a call to action to make our own voice heard. This exhibition calls upon the strategies and insights offered by artists to articulate a space of dissonance as a model of action in everyday life. As a side note, in autumn 2017, when the exhibition happened, it was a time of extremely heightened tensions in South Korea, with daily mass demonstrations by students and other groups only a stone's throw away from the museum, as well as wider international tensions in the region. That's the end.
Thank you. Sorry, Emma, to jump in there. Thank you so much. I think let's just jump over. Roger, do you want to?
Hi, I'm going to talk about the British Art Show across time, really the history rather than no reference at all to the new forthcoming version. And I'm going to read it, I'm afraid. You can prod me to speed up if I'm too slow. When I began to think about ways in which the British Art Show had responded to or reflected questions of national identity over the past 4 decades, it struck me once again how ideal a 5-year interval is for marking time in the art world. A new generation of artists emerges in that period, and changes in the cultural and political climate are registered. In 1984, the question of gender or racial representation was not really at the forefront. I can't remember anyone thinking to count up the number of women, or what in those days might have been called ethnic minority or culturally diverse artists. In fact, out of a total of 84 artists, there were 14 of the former and 2 of the latter. Although Anish Kapoor or Shirazeh Hushari would have taken exception to being singled out in those terms. It's actually worth noting that both of those artists declined to be in Rashid Areen's exhibition, The Other Story, at the Hayward Gallery 5 years later. Anyway, the breadth and catholicity of the British Art Show in general, the selection meant that most artistic tendencies were represented. And the only controversy I recall was the media reaction to the performance artist Alastair MacLennan, a Scottish artist living in Belfast, whose visceral performances expressed his abhorrence of the violence of the Troubles. That reminds me in this context that although there have been artists in the British Art Show, usually from Northern Ireland, it has never actually been to Belfast. It was always assumed that the British Art Show would not go down well with Republicans. And despite the fact that it has traveled to 14 cities across Britain in those 40 years, it's never been to Ireland, Northern Ireland. And that remains, I guess it's obvious, the single most difficult and enduring fault line in British politics. Since each British Art Show is curated by different people, it only rests on the organizers, the Hayward Gallery, to make the appropriate choice. That choice has in recent years been made in collaboration with the partner venues. I should confess that there's never been a Black curator. There have been Black artists, of course, starting with Frank Bowling in '79, Sonia Boyce in 1990, Chris Ofili and Steve McQueen in '96. But Yinka Shonabare, in a Guardian interview some years ago, answered the question as to what was his greatest disappointment, that it was not being in a British art show. And the truth is, that's a disappointment we share, in retrospect. The British Art Show in '96 concentrated on what became known as the YBAs, and that narrowing of artistic range brought into focus a major source of friction between the metropolis, London, and the regions. The curators of the British Art Show have always been at pains to be seen to be traveling to every corner of the country in search of talent. But British Art Show 4 picked a majority of its artists from London, and specifically from one art school, Goldsmiths. This caused outrage among the curators from Wales at the first briefing session, although the public, in fact, hardly noticed the bias. What was barely acknowledged then was that Goldsmith students came from every part of the country, and many of them were working class. I remember in 2000 being caught out by a canny reporter in Edinburgh into confessing that the very title British Art Show was embarrassing in its jingoistic, nationalistic overtones. And that was the news spread across the front page of the Scotsman on the day of the opening. We used to wish for a more dignified, neutral title like Documenta. But colleagues in press and marketing always reminded us that British Art Show has an all-embracing, authoritative ring to it, its own kind of inclusiveness. And the audience figures spoken for themselves. By 2005, Britain was opening up culturally to the wider world, and 30% of the artists in British Art Show 6 were born and raised elsewhere, in Germany, Holland, France, Italy, Turkey, North America, Serbia, Uganda, and so on. Interestingly, that iteration, the most cosmopolitan to date, was curated by Alex Farquharson and Andrea Schleicher, who have since become director of exhibitions and displays at Tate Britain. The criterion for inclusion in a British art show was never a passport or a national insurance number, simply the fact that an artist had lived in the country for a portion of the past 5 years and had made a significant contribution. Complicating this is the consideration of British artists living abroad, who also qualified. And compounding that, in 2015, the exhibition included several artists who had only briefly spent time working in Britain, but whose influence here continued to be felt. This reflected a new model of the artist as nomad, flying by the nets of nationality. Whether that model can withstand the fallout of Brexit is doubtful. We've already seen the impact on performing artists touring in Europe, but that's another subject. Thank you.
Thank you, Roger. I think there's so much there to unpack, hopefully, in discussion. And to round out these sort of opening statements, Frances, welcome, and over to you.
I'm just unmuted. Thank you so much. Can I just correct the gender in my name? And it always makes me panic when I see myself as a man. I'm definitely female. So the I needs to be an E. Also panicking a little bit because although delighted to speak about Tate's International Partnerships Programme, I'm very aware that half the attendees of this webinar are colleagues from across Tate, and many of them are really invested in the subject that we're discussing today. And I don't really have any particular ownership or indeed leadership of this area, but I am now responsible for overseeing the programme of international partnership exhibitions led by Neil McConnon from Tate Modern, but it is really a cross-Tate initiative. Now, Tate has one collection, and it's a decentered collection that's used by 4 sites and shared across the UK and distributed in many forms, both through site-based touring programmes, but I'm just going to talk particularly about this programme of international partnership exhibitions that dates from around 2000. Exhibitions drawn almost, not completely, but almost exclusively from the collection and made principally in exchange for higher fees. And this was a strategy that was introduced in the early days of this century, just after the establishment of Tate Modern, so at a time of growing ambitions for Tate, but at a time of diminishing public funds. So the drive behind taking the collection on tour was effectively to create a sustainable income stream from those exhibitions, but also in doing so, build communities of partners, relationships internationally that would benefit Tate in all sorts of ways, both in terms of the profit, but also create a more textured place for Tate in an international cultural community. It was seen very much, it's interesting, both Emma and Roger spoke with deep knowledge of their subject specialism. It's really interesting that at Tate, because this is, although really important, it's also sort of marginal. And this is one of the great bugbears for all of us now involved in it. We want to bring it center stage, but there isn't a research forum that I can go and get data from. So I've been hugely helped in putting this stuff together by 2 colleagues, Katie Chester and Debbie Minura. But there's a lot that I still don't know about this recent past. But it was seen at the time clearly as some kind of alternative to the Guggenheim's global franchise operation. And Tate deliberately took a decision not to create Tates abroad, but to create connections and partnerships abroad in their place. The very, very first exhibitions in 2000, 2001 were Turner, Turner at Sea Again, Turner and Claude Lorraine, Whistler, Sergeant Steer, and those sort of names give you some sense of the tone of shows that were devoted to the kind of the immortal greats of British art and to what still, I suppose one might call its national treasures. But looking then to the last 5 years or so the snapshot from 2014 to 2016 is quite interesting. 36 exhibition venues, so not separate exhibitions, but touring to 36 partner galleries, 29 exclusively drawn from the British collection, 15 out of 16 were monographic shows by male artists, the exception, of course, being Hepworth, exclusively white story, and principal income generators within those 36 venues were Hockney with 3 exhibitions, unsurprisingly, and Turner with 8. So Turner has absolutely swept the board over 20 years by being the export market. But there were broader narratives of British art around British landscapes, which went to 6 venues, the nudes from Tate's collection, which went to 4 venues, and the School of London exhibition, which went to 5. And I thought it would be interesting just to say a word about that School of London show because of the narrative of British art as told in that show and its divergence from the narrative as told at Tate Britain. And this was one of the few examples of a show that took place both as a touring international partnerships programme and at Tate Britain. So the School of London show that went initially to Getty, part of the International Partnerships tour, was absolutely classic. Boys in London, Bacon, Freud, Kossoff, Andrews, about Kittai. When the show then went on to Moscow, Rome and Malaga, Paula Rago was added to the mix. And then when the show came back to London, it was reset and recharged within a wider time frame as All Too Human, with the introduction of a significant proportion of British female artists and a much higher proportion of work drawn as loans rather than taken from the British collection. It is worth noting that the visitor figures for international partnerships programs are huge compared to the footfall of visitors to exhibitions at our London sites or regional sites. And it's also worth noticing, when I go through these kind of statistics blandly, that there's always been a concern, and it's always minuted and always returns about a possible gap between the intellectual and artistic integrity of the programme and the narratives that we explore in our UK sites and the story of British art that we sell abroad. And earlier on, I mean, we've talked about this before with Hammad, this sort of gap between profit and purpose that somehow is kind of parallel to that narrative between the Downton Abbey model and the Small Axe model. It is changing. As I said, we have a new leadership of international partnerships. Neil McConnell has brought the team into Tate Modern, and there's been an immediate infusion of interest from the wider curatorial team, and a sense that we need to move international partnerships into a place where it reflects the transnational commitments of both Tate Britain and Tate Modern. And just one example there to show you perhaps future directions, a recent request for an op show from a Chinese venue. I think they must have seen images of the wonderful op display at Tate Liverpool that took place last year, was reconfigured by Clara Kim, senior curator at Tate Modern, as a World Goes Pop exhibition, which will have those British treasures at their heart, a room of Bridget Riley, for example, but really thinks about the international entanglement of op from a UK perspective and other points of view. So alongside those British artists, there's a focus on the activities of a Signals Gallery, an interface between British and Latin American artists, for example, the Latin American Paris connection, and we'll take from Tate Modern the whole installation of a view from Zagreb that we have at the moment on our walls, and substantial work from the Sao Paulo display. So a kind of much more transnational view of British art, which I find personally incredibly exciting. Of course, that brings its own set of challenges. Traditionally, international partnerships have drawn from parts of the programs where the holdings are deep and rich. You know, we have over 30,000 works by Turner, but drawing on recent acquisitions, telling more diverse narratives, international partnerships is always also trying to align with stories that are urgently needful of telling in London, Liverpool and St. Ives. So looking at the historically overlooked is creating issues of availability of clean works. We all want to show David Madala. We all want to show Gago. So with that, some of the challenges of Tate's international programs, I hand back to Elizabeth, I think. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Frances. And now over to you, Abbas, who's been again invited to sort of share his own responses to this set of questions, and also to draw some of the threads from the statements that have come before.
Thank you again for the invitation. I really appreciate that my position compared to most of the panelists is very junior. I don't come with these kind of accolades, but Hammad was very kind to invite me as a sort of sounding board for what has been said. And so as Frances sort of prefixed her talk, I'm going to say that nothing I say is authoritative from any perspective or agenda. It's just literally some food for thought in response to what I've heard and what I've been considering since I received this invitation, actually, because it's quite a big ask, you know, to kind of answer this question. And for me, I feel like the most honest way of understanding this question of Britishness and how it actually can be defined, it's an evasive one, I find. I feel that there is no, we are not a country that necessarily has a defined patriotic identity. I mean, we have a royal family and we have a parliament and we have a House of Lords and we have, you know, all kinds of different systems of governance in place. And at the same time, you know, things are very pragmatic. We prefer to abide by common law. You know, these kind of things are quite fluid, and I think that's something that sometimes it's sort of given this impression that change is or kind of progress is kind of built into the system, and on the other hand, it may be the case that the actual kind of where the levers of power are, where the kind of things are kind of governed from the center in a way that isn't necessarily transparent. And I think as someone who's the offspring of migrants who came to this country in the 80s from Iran, you know, I've grown up with a certain narrative, a troublesome one between where my parents came from and where I've been here. You know, I'm often reminded of the Rushdie affair. You know, and as I'm talking about it, there's some banging happening in the studio next to me, so I apologize if that's affected my sound. But these kind of ominous parts of history seem to follow me. You know, my background, just to clarify, I actually trained as a doctor. I spent many years studying to be a medic, and then following the loss of my family and particularly my younger brother around 11 years ago, I came out of that discipline and went into community organizing. I went into kind of local arts practices, mainly around craft. I worked with people who were in charge of national heritage sites, things like stonemasonry, calligraphy. So I was very interested in these kind of traditional intersections of art, and to spend some time even at the Princess School of Traditional Art in Shoreditch. So for me, that kind of idea of multiplicity, pluralism actually came through addressing a kind of more traditional concern rather than a contemporary one. And it was kind of through that discourse that I felt like I had maximized the value of understanding the kind of sacredness of octagons. I kind of then moved on to something that felt a bit more with the times. But I feel like that kind of process of kind of inhabiting the past and understanding its limits and its failures and so forth is quite a fruitful practice. And I feel like as people were speaking, you know, I've kind of I made some notes, and so I'm not going to directly respond to each panelist, but kind of this is maybe a platter of ideas, so to speak. And I think it's kind of I like to be very instinctive in these things. It's like certain things come to mind, stuff maybe I haven't thought of in years, you know, and I try to think of what is my own relationship as someone who's coming from a situation that could be described as a kind of, you know, this idea of like anomie, like someone who feels dislocated within the society and kind of carries a sense of dislocated grief. And a lot of my contemporary work since 2017, which is kind of when I came to be working in contemporary art, has kind of revolved around this idea of grief, which refers to personal grief and bereavements, and also kind of wider, more social ones, in particular the Grenfell tragedy, which I'm very closely connected to. And this sense of grief kind of is something that is now a bit more pronounced, is widespread. Let's say because of the pandemic, we've all suffered and had to face certain realities, and also been made aware of the level of interdependence that we have. And so even these kind of binaries, which Roger referred to as between the kind of provinces and the cities, the kind of David Goodhart analogy of the somewheres and the anywheres, you know, like this is something that I've been thinking a lot about, and you know, how I probably occupy both of those positions because I come from a provincial family that was put in kind of West London and had to navigate both of those in this state of multiplicity. And what I realized is that when I went to art school at Central St. Martin's in 2017, after actually coming back from the Venice Biennale, which is kind of bizarre, in the case that I was in a show in the Biennale, part of the Diaspora Pavilion, and then I went to art school. So it's kind of, for me, I came with quite a different perspective. And one of the things that I kept hearing whilst I was studying is this idea of trying to cultivate this sense of having like an inner pluralism, like this kind of inner multiplicity. Everything becomes kind of more diverse, both internally and externally. And in many ways, I felt like it was slightly redundant, because if you've grown up in the kind of struggling like with various class dynamics, migration, could be gender, could be race, could be religion, all these different things, you already inculcate this as almost like a default position. So I felt like even the educational system, it was kind of trying to incorporate that into, like it was kind of coming from the perspective of, we don't have this, let's develop this. And I was like, no, I've already got this. I just need to know how to talk about it to people who don't have it. You know, it's kind of, so I'll listen and I'll kind of feedback in a way. So it's kind of strange thing. And even when Hammad came to see my show in Chelsea, you know, there was all these different layers that I felt like some of, you know, because of the particular connections that he has in his life, he was able to decipher some of the aspects of my work, which I sometimes describe as this kind of linguistic mode of code switching. You know, there's like, maybe I'm saying one thing, but it comes across another way, and maybe another thing kind of only speaks to a certain person. And I think sometimes when we talk about public institutions and this kind of public presentation of art, there is a fear from the institutional perspective to kind of have those layered codes, and things have to be very explicit and on display. And so that brings me back to this painting that I actually first saw when I was a medic, and one of my teachers was a very big fan of Sherlock Holmes and Arthur Conan Doyle and this kind of investigative approach to medicine. And he took us to the National Gallery and he was showing us paintings, and he was particularly kind of interested in the Hans Holbein the Younger painting, The Ambassadors, from 1533. And you know, it's the one where you have these two Frenchmen and they have their shelves full of these objects in the middle that have come back from kind of colonial explorations. And you know, there's things like rugs and astrolabes and a lute and you know this fancy globe and things like this, and it's kind of, both of them are standing there side by side and this thing is in the middle. And then you have this skewed skull which you have to look at sideways to resolve the image. And you know, I've been fixated on this image for a long time, ever since I saw it as a medic, trying to understand how I could use it as a tool to diagnose patients better. And now I'm kind of thinking of it as almost like as an encoded logic of how kind of institutional practices function in relation to like, you know, people from marginal backgrounds or people of color, people of kind of who are facing oppression in multiple forms. And it's like the institution, or whoever is part of the institution, is these kind of people standing next to the shelves, and the artists that they've collected, or the program that they have, is this kind of mixture of things that is the kind of de rigueur fanciful objects of the time. And then there is this kind of genius move that someone has to make of being this sideways skull to make everyone pay attention. So I often feel like I don't want to be on the shelf, I want to be the skull, which you know, it's like that's how I had to understand things. And so you know, there is like, so it's kind of, but then at the same time it's like I don't even want to be in that picture. I want to go make it something else. I want to go make lemonade. I want to, you know, I don't want to make pictures like this. And so these are the kind of questions that always come to mind for me. And so when I kind of think about the relationship between a kind of institutional narrative, you know, the institution is not devoid of other structures that exist. I mean, now, yeah, we have social media, we have all these different things that kind of influence our perspectives. However, you know, as I said before, it's like I consider myself a direct kind of inheritor of the Black art movement, let's say. You know, like I came as a result of that thing because whilst I was doing community work, I was talking about neo-diaspora, and suddenly someone from there, namely David A. Bailey, you know, kind of selected me as part of a panel of people to go in the diaspora pavilion. And so suddenly I turned up and I have all these people around me who are legendary art world figures, and I'm trying to talk to them about neo-diaspora. And that kind of was a very, very interesting experience. And at the same time, it was very much within that kind of Holbein-esque ambassadors rubric that we were being displayed in Venice. So, you know, kind of coming away from that, I appreciate the entry point into a community of artists that I'm now benefiting from in this position. However, it kind of makes me feel like that these things take a long time to change. You know, these are generational things that we're discussing. And so in my kind of time growing up, like looking at the kind of British sort of establishment narratives in relation to what I personally associate with my own kind of cultural position, certain things came to mind as I was listening to the talks. And I don't know why, I kept seeing images of Jeremy Paxman talking to people that I felt very connected to. So I remember this one time Jeremy Paxman was interviewing Dizzy Rascal on TV, and my background is also in music. I grew up in part of that grime generation, so I saw Dizzy almost like a peer. You know, obviously I'm not successful musically, but still, like, you know, that I was like, yeah, Paxman's like talking to one of us, you know. And so for me, this idea of like grime as a British musical genre, I think is probably the last genuinely kind of British musical genre that was created. I think anything that comes now is very international and hybridized from the get-go. Whereas grime, you know, the pirate radio and all this stuff that we were doing in like studios and basements and stuff, it was like a really different way of kind of having this incubator space to develop a genre. And I just remember that, you know, Paxman was so dismissive to Dizzy Rascal, even asking him, do you think you could ever be prime minister? You know, and it was just like a sort of a piss take. Whereas when he spoke to Russell Brand, for example, it was a completely different conversation. Paxman was almost trying to flirt with him. And then I remember there was this other example of when Fuse ODG, an artist who was kind of working with Afrobeat. It's a new genre that's come out in the last 4 or 5 years. I would say it's a British hybrid, West African British genre. And, you know, Paxman was trying to talk to him about Conrad's Heart of Darkness, you know, and is completely irrelevant to the conversation. And I just wondered, like, why isn't someone like John Gray, the economist, there to talk about his book, Silence of Animals, if you want to talk about Conrad's Heart of Darkness? You know, this isn't like it. So I always felt very frustrated. And I think one of the things I remember the most is bringing it back to art now, is one of these same kind of forums was, I think, the South Bank show with Melvin Bragg. And there was one time where they were talking about Muslims in art, and they asked what do you expect like a Muslim artist to do? What could they do that's interesting and exciting? You know, and this is someone like Melvin Bragg talking to, you know, panelists like him, and they were like, you know, we need a Muslim piss Christ. like a Serrano thing. And I was like, wow, this feels so like, it just felt like, sorry to say it, but like primitive in a way, to make that kind of a statement. Like we need someone to come and desecrate their culture for us to be excited by them, and like for me, it's no big deal. Like you could have that, and I would engage with it artistically as any artwork. I think these kind of statements can have a lot of merit, but to have that kind of stayed with me as a thing, and I thought, wow, this relationship between kind of these acts of defecation and how we deal with symbolic objects, it's a kind of an ongoing trope that feels quite tired. And then I think I mentioned it in one of our previous meetings where I saw this Adam Curtis documentary where it had the British Council representative in Afghanistan during the Afghan war time, and they were kind of speaking to some Afghan students, women in hijab, and they were teaching them about the Marcel Duchamp's urinal. There's a conference room full of Afghan students, and you had Duchamp's urinal being explained to them. And I just thought to myself, wow, this is so interesting. Like, this is almost like a missionary type of activity. Like, Duchamp's urinal is now a symbolic object. So these kind of inversions and conversions for me felt quite interesting, and I always wonder, like, what's the reverse of that? Like, what would it be if we had an Afghan student right now telling us stuff? And I guess someone like Malala Yousafzai comes to mind, but that's again something that's happening within this logic, again with that ambassador's logic. And so yeah, maybe sorry,
can we just thinking,
I'll wrap up.
Introduce such good questions. I sort of want to start getting them to the other
okay, very good. So I can stop there. Basically, my solution is grand music. Let's go into the Q&A. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Abbas. Sorry to
No, I appreciate it. Thank you.
Everybody off, I feel like. I actually wanted to pick up something that you mentioned, this idea of code switching, and actually I see in the Q&A that that's also been picked up, I think very unsurprisingly by some of our attendees and our panelists. And I was wondering how we might think about this code switching, I think, that happens. I think, Francis, you talked about it a bit, between the stories that are, the stories of Britishness is this construction of what British art is or looks like, or Britishness is or looks like. The code switch that happens when that's produced in this country, versus, how might we think about telling those stories internationally? Do you know what I mean? Telling those stories to an international audience who might be more used to seeing, and I think something else that we might want to think about is want to see the sort of, as you said, the sort of Downton Abbey recreated.
Well, maybe I could just kick off by saying something. First, Abbas, you spoke so eloquently. I need to see a transcript of your text to fully appreciate it. But I did write code switching down and encoded practice and Hans Holbein. And I love the idea that I might be one of those ambassadors. I think I'd have the one with the furry bit. But if I was an artist, I definitely want to be the skull on edge. But what I was thinking, it reminded me of, I haven't seen many of our international touring shows. Very few of us have, because they take place in Hong Kong and Shanghai and around the world. But I did see a the British landscape painting show in Shanghai on a Sunday afternoon in a hot sunshine. And I joined a line of about 750 people lining up to get into this show. And it was the most extraordinary experience, because there were some famous iconic works, but there was also a great number of works drawn from the stores that rarely see the light of day, that were genre scenes of country houses and hunting or maritime. And because I was with an almost entirely Chinese audience, I kind of saw it with different eyes. And actually, it was completely astonishing and fascinating and brilliantly diverse and complex. And I saw British history in a way for kind of what it is. It was kind of revealed. So I think that encoding thing is really interesting, because curatorially, it's actually very difficult to determine the way you're coding or encoding, or how that will be deconstructed by your audience, who will bring its own life experience and world framework to looking at what, in an export situation, can feel very curious. It was as curious seeing British painting in that context as it was to seeing Chinese ink painting at the Royal Academy.
Perhaps if I could also connect that to Emma, sort of wonderful example of this art of dissonance that you shared with us as one possibility in this code switching. And I wonder if you got a chance to see that in Seoul and look at the UK through, Korean post-Brexit eyes.
I did, yes. I went over for a series of events because Lubena Himid was invited to give a talk, and it was at the end of the exhibition. And so that was why I wanted to talk about it, because it was quite remarkable to literally step outside the museum and then walk into the center of Seoul and see the demonstrations that were taking place. It was just ahead of the visit of Trump. There were an awful lot of security around. It was a very charged atmosphere, but it was also an atmosphere in which people were expressing their opinions. So it was just, it was a genius act of Gahi. I don't know whether she knew all of the talks with North Korea were going to kick off around that time, and everything was going to become so complex, but it was quite remarkable and quite spine-tingling in a way. I think what I wanted to talk about in terms of code switching was rather the question about who is asked for within British art exhibitions, and I think this goes back to, again, the sort of touring model and the names that Francis referred to earlier. I think we now, I think, through our new ways of working, engaging in a conversation with curators, are sort of keen to introduce people to artists that they might not otherwise know, because otherwise you do get the same names being circulated, and they are male and they are white and have a historical presence. I mean, that's just how, kind of publicity and history work together, and they feed on each other. And so I suppose we do dare take the position that we should be stimulating people, that we have a sort of slightly mentoring role, stimulating people's interest and encouraging them to look beyond what they knew already when they started to talk to us about a collaboration, I suppose. But Gahi Park, in that particular instance, I think had studied in the UK, had spent time in the UK, and she was already extremely well attuned to the kind of artist that she knew she wanted to be in the show.
It's really interesting. Thank you. Oh, come on, sorry, did you have a follow-up?
I had a sort of a specific question to Roger, if I may. Roger, you sort of shared with us the fact that in your 4 decades of overseeing the British Art Show, it's never been to Northern Ireland.
Yeah.
Despite the fact, and I wonder, if we can sort of pursue that questioning for a bit, because Londonderry was the city of culture. It did host the Turner Prize, and sort of to do something like that at a place like Derry, I would have thought would have been, in using yes minister language, being a courageous decision. And I wonder why, or what was it that prevented, or did you go and visit Northern Ireland at that time and decided that nope, we can't risk this?
Thanks so much. I haven't had experience literally for 4 decades quite, but since '84, it was there was never a conscious effort made, because it didn't feel. I mean, this is another aspect, but it's just in a way the same it's an aspect of the same question. Has the British art show ever been abroad? Well, no, it hasn't, because it's kind of local, and well, this is not the same question at all, because, you know, I mean, as I said, I think the fault line between Northern Ireland and Britain is extremely difficult and intractable one, and it is no. I mean, you could say the Turner Prize. The Turner Prize is sort of neutral. The term the British Art Show is so emphatically national in its identification, self-identification, that it's sort of, I don't know. It wasn't anything. It was never really explored. I mean, it's an enormous exhibition. It couldn't have fitted in the galleries in Derry. I have worked in the Void, in collaboration with the Void in Derry on an exhibition, and it's very interesting to work there. And we've also worked in collaboration with galleries in Belfast. And Belfast is really the only city which possibly could conceivably, and even then probably doesn't have the space to accommodate an exhibition of that scale. So that's one sort of simple practical question. But I think my assumption was simply, I mean, it's not just, I wasn't the one who made the decision, but it was never requested. If there'd been an approach, we quite often have responded to approaches from cities which want to take the British Art Show because they know it has major impact and draws a big crowd and you know, is worth having. So several cities in Britain, like Plymouth and Nottingham and a number of others, have made positive approaches to us, and we've never been approached by a gallery in Belfast or Derry.
Hammad, can I just add something to what Roger's just said? Because Roger, I don't know if you remember, but I did briefly entertain a conversation with you about trying to internationalize.
Absolutely, I do very much.
When I first joined the British Council,
yes.
And I think we realized that it was such a complex project, it would have been extremely costly, but also I think for all the reasons that Roger has already explained, the loadedness of that title is just so heavy that you know, it was sort of counter to what I was hoping we could try and do with British Council exhibitions, if you see what I mean, and reverse that sort of you know, that sort of slightly jingoistic tone and make things more thematic, whereas it was very hard to do that when it's called the British Art Show. So we had a really interesting debate about it, but in the end we sort of decided it wasn't really on.
Absolutely. I mean, Emma, you made great efforts actually to introduce us to some international curators who came to the British Art Show in Edinburgh, I think, and spent time looking at the work. And each of them would have, I mean, it's off-putting, let's face it. I mean, you, as a national-based show, which simply, you know, was proclaiming itself to be the Swedish art show or the German art show, we wouldn't necessarily want that. We would want to make our own selection, and that's and
I think actually weirdly I think Gahi Park may well have been on the tour that we brought to see the British.
I think I have rings a bell.
And I think actually it is interesting that a lot of the artists who were in that iteration in 2015 then went on to have exhibitions in East Asia, including what's her name, McLean, again, who had a solo show I think in China. So actually I think that's the model for internationalizing, is to bring non-UK based curators to come and see the British Art Show and then really introduce, I mean, and obviously this latest iteration of yours, Hammad, sounds amazing. Yeah, we obviously must try and make sure that as many curators come to visit us as possible, who then will organize
those. I remember the discussions with those curators, who were largely, I think, from South Korea. You know, nobody wanted to take the show lock, stock, and barrel. They were interested in it, but they were curators themselves, and they wanted to play an active part in selecting a group of artists from it, which they could have easily done. But the idea of simply, you know, buying the show as a whole, really, it was neither kind of feasible in economic and practical terms, nor particularly desirable. There was the British the British Council. I remember there is if you look in the file somewhere, I think about 1984, they did an exhibition. Maybe it went to Australia. It was called the British Show, and it was a little similar to an old-fashioned British art show with largely painting and sculpture.
Interesting. Hammad, sorry, I see. Did you have any? Okay. I had actually a question for all of you, really. So we've sort of thought quite a bit about the sort of internationalism. What might it the British art should look like internationally, and that sort of as we were saying before, the sort of code switching between telling the stories that we tell ourselves at home, if you like, and those that we tell other people about ourselves. And so I was wondering how those stories play out outside of the center, but still within this country. So what happens, as Francis, as you said, when something goes not just from Tate's London homes, but to Liverpool or to St Ives or Roger, where they, move between, what was it, 14 cities?
Yes.
That you discussed. So I wonder if you could talk a bit about that, that divide, because it's not just Britain and the world, and to bring back Abbas's words, which again were so rich, where the somewheres aren't just Britain. Arguably the somewhere is usually London, and here in Bristol we are the anywheres. Yeah,
I mean, there's always an implicit emphasis on the metropolis. I mean, that is one of the massive imbalances in this country between the resources and the cultural activity in the metropolis and the regions. And I mean, I speak as somebody who grew up in a small town in Essex, and I know exactly how frustrating and boring it is to be in a small town in a provincial county. A lot of the time, if you're growing up, there's not that much to do. You want to get to London. In the old days, when the economy somehow permitted it, because you could come to London as a student, a former student, and squat or find a cheap place to rent, the natural thing for each generation of artists, I think, was to gravitate to London. I mean, talking about artists as opposed to the general public. So that's one aspect of this. I think that although it is a single country, there's a massive emphasis of resources and attention on life in the city in a way which doesn't necessarily happen in other countries. And it's historical, obviously, it goes back centuries. And so I think that for young people, I'm guessing, I mean, the British Art Show does have a very young audience. Statistically, it's been checked, I can't remember now offhand, but it is, a high proportion of visitors are young. They don't come to it, I don't think, I'm guessing, because I'm not necessarily there, but one doesn't expect them to be coming to it with any sense of us and them, that they're looking at their peers, the work of their peers or near peers, younger artists, and wanting something with energy. It is it's like the circus coming to town. There are moments in a small town. I can remember the circus coming to town, or the fair. Twice a year the fair would come to my little town in Essex, and it was a big deal. And obviously it was going around the whole country and touring to different places, and where it originated or whether it really even had a base anywhere else it was immaterial. So
Alice, did you want to jump in?
Yeah, it was a question really for Francis and Emma, and it was about which nation travels, because Francis, in your list of exhibitions about dead white artists who travel, we have Turner and Constable and the School of London, and Emma, in talking about the Venice Biennale and the British Pavilion, I know you didn't mention specifically, but in terms of what the British Council does, I'm wondering about Venice and the British Pavilion, and the fact that until recently Northern Ireland, Wales and Scotland have had their own pavilions. So does that mean that by de facto the British pavilion is the English pavilion.
Mm.
And is there a sort of a scenario in which Tate would be exporting exhibitions made of Scottish artists or Welsh artists as a distinct identity of the nation? So that's two halves.
Yeah. Maybe I just pick up on that first. I think the answer is no. I think the direction of travel is towards a much more complex understanding of nation. I think even although there will continue clearly to be an appetite from certain parts of the world and certain venues to present shows drawn from the collection of our Turner holdings, we will be much more proactive in encouraging venues to have a more, critical or textured or, refresh their approaches to our collection, which is a transnational collection. It's a international and British, and increasingly the kind of strategic thinking behind the collection is about how things connect, not how they separate. So how they connect across boundaries of geography, race, media. So I think that's the direction of travel. But can I just also return to that question about decentering?
Yeah.
I just wanted to say, I think one of the really interesting things about Tate in the last few years, under the directorship of the two new directors at Tate Liverpool and Tate St Ives, is a really interesting and parallel but different initiatives to think about a different sense of how the local connects with the international. And can be not decentered, but actually can be centered in a decentered space, if you see what I mean. So Helen really trying to think about how Liverpool has its own story and its own interface with the world and issues, and how it is at the intersection of generations of migration, for example, that speaks to a different reading of British history, and how St Ives is in such a marginal position, but for a period of time was absolutely the epicenter of a kind of international engagement in British art. So I think there are some, I think that model that Roger spoke to very, without nostalgia, I think is really being challenged by the two Tate regional sites.
Could I just say another thing in relation to sort of center versus periphery? Because I think it is something that used to exercise me quite a lot. I mean, just purely looking at the country objectively and looking at activity. I'm talking about exhibitions happening in cities like Birmingham and Manchester, the larger cities, or Cardiff, as opposed to in their own periphery. That Manchester, I know for a fact that a Manchester art world will rarely bother to descend, will rarely kind of take the trouble to get on a tram and go to Rochdale or Bolton or Oldham to see what might be an excellent exhibition, because it's simply not in their, they see themselves as Londoners are so full of themselves and so proud of being Londoners. Manchester looks down on Oldham, and Birmingham looks down on Wolverhampton and even Walsall, and Cardiff, it's hard to get people from Cardiff to get on a train and go to Swansea. So I mean, I think this imbalance, it's all relative, but all of these smaller cities, but still quite substantial with their own focus, energy, and so on, they do see themselves as centers and look down on their own small peripheries around them.
That's really interesting. And I'm thinking about the ways in which sort of if we move things, if we recenter, as Francis is saying, if we shift that thing from the Manchester art world won't go here to what's going on in the Oldham art world. I wonder what happens, what that looks like. Yeah, Marlene.
I think that one very empowering thing is the international collaboration, and there have been collaborations between. Now over the last 30 years, there's a massive shift there has been a great growth of curatorial imagination and energy in regional centres, and Manchester galleries collaborate internationally and so on, and that gives them a sense of empowerment, and they're no longer dependent on a supply of culture from the centre, from the metropolis.
Yeah. Marlene, did you want to chime in? Oh, you're muted. You're muted.
Can you hear me now? Yeah, so just kind of jumping in on that point about the center and the periphery, which is a theme that I've kind of worked with a lot within my own practice. Just and speaking as I am today from the center of the universe, which is obviously Birmingham. Yes. I think there's a whole kind of richness within which disparagingly called the provinces in terms of those collections. I think it's a really exciting moment to be linking up what exists in those cities, in those commercial centers, in those centers of migration, in those centers of trade, and with those audiences. So I think there's a huge story here about not only what's in collections, what contemporary artists are making all over the country, and interestingly as well, on top of that, is that a lot of artists can't afford to be in the center anymore. So there's a sort of decentering of practice. Yeah. That's happening in lots of huge post-industrial cities around the country. And so I think it's really interesting when there's major movements around literally taking art from one place to another. And I think there have been some models, particularly in recent years, where a center, a gallery becomes the focal point for those kinds of discussions about for me, what is interesting about the British Art Show and why I would go to the British Art Show is because I want to have a sense of who's making art, who I have not seen before, whose work I know and what they're making today. And I think the idea that the British Art Show tells me something about Britishness, for me personally, that is not really what my expectation of that show. So for me, the code switching that Abbas and Francis and others have referred to, for me, there's a kind of there's a dismantling of this notion of a number of notions, but certainly the notion of a particular Britishness, and certainly that Britishness is somehow exercised through contemporary art practice. If anything, I think that what's exciting about contemporary art practice is that it dismantles those notions. But that's not really a question. Yeah. I just wanted to make that comment.
Could I just respond, please? Thank you, Marlene. I really appreciate this perspective, and it reminded me again of that meeting that you were in Wolverhampton in 1983 with Rashid Areen and the origins of the Black Art movement. And in that meeting, Rashid actually said that being on the periphery does not necessarily mean the condition of surrogatory and submission. Periphery must have its own dynamic. And so I think with this, there is no conversation really about center, decenter. There are we have these different dynamics, and it's really our duty to kind of try to expand the way that they intersect and interact and kind of work together, and sometimes clash as well, because in the clash we find some interesting outcomes, like the Hadron Collider that they're trying to do, So for me, when I think of this idea of code switch and decentering and stuff, I'll kind of give an example from my own work, because really this is the kind of thing I guess I'm trying to imply, and it's a sort of logic that I discovered when I was almost in charge of my own mini institution. So I had this show in Chelsea in what was the old Victorian sorting office in SW3. and the show was being kind of delayed a lot last year. We opened it in early December, and after 11 days, there was the tier 3 announcements before Christmas, and the show went into lockdown. So I was kind of there, you know, sort of abandoned by the sort of curators and everyone else. And I had access to this whole building, which, you know, if I open the building, is empty inside. And I have an exhibition in there using sound, installation, etc., etc. Now, I was thinking to myself, well, you know, it's kind of absurd. Like, this is an empty building. If someone can come here safely, they can go inside, see the show. But however, we're in lockdown, it's a difficult situation. I don't want to just be this kind of vainglorious person, come and see my work. But I had this kind of idea put into me when I saw this, I think it was from the Times, this public poll, which said, now we differentiate people into who is useful and who is useless. Doctors are useful, artists are useless. These were the top 2 of the poll. And I'm as an ex sort of medic, and across the road from the exhibition site was a hospital that I had quite a strong connection to through my brother and various ex-colleagues, called the Brompton Hospital in Chelsea. And this is the lung specialist of the UK. So, you know, COVID is a big concern of theirs. And so, you know, I was just thinking to myself, this is absurd. Like, there are these new social binaries emerging. We have somewheres and anywheres. Now we have useful and useless. So then I think to myself, okay, let me reach out to the doctors. Some of my friends also in neurology, they're this group called Neurofringe. And we kind of came to the show together and looked at the space, and I was very aware that within the lockdown guidelines, you can host therapy spaces or support spaces, and people up to 15 people can physically still meet, even in the strictest lockdown. So then we kind of worked together, me and these medics, talking about how can we code switch the entire show as a support space. We didn't change anything in the exhibition. We just said, this is not our exhibition now, this is a support space. It's a somewhere for therapy, and actually it's only for frontline workers. So suddenly every day, multiple times, medics are coming, people from the transport system are coming, all these frontline workers are coming into the space saying, we need a space for our own kind of mental health, as a kind of remedial space, as a space of restitution, because we're getting hammered on the front lines. So people from COVID ITU wards were coming into our exhibition at a time where every gallery in the entire country was closed. But I was able to host this intervention, and like I'll put a link to it in the chat if anyone wants to actually check it out. We have videos and pictures and stuff of what was actually taking place. And the reason I talk about this in this particular session is we're talking about how does British art travel. Now, as I mentioned, I developed this project in collaboration with a group of neurologists, and in January, so we ran this project for about 6-7 weeks. Lots of people came from the front lines, and then the neurologists themselves submitted this intervention to a neurology conference, the European Association of Neurologists, which is taking place in June. So an international conference in which neurologists from all over the world, like I think there'll be thousands of them, has received this abstract from this group of neurologists saying that we use the art space as a support space for people in the time of lockdown in the UK, as a kind of British presentation within this context of a neurology conference. And the abstract got accepted and upgraded to a platform presentation. So now we're preparing this to give in June a platform presentation, which is essentially a British art show that got code switched into a support space and is now being presented internationally by a group of neurologists. So I'm doing an international traveling show, you could say, or something, you know, British art is traveling through this very small gesture. And now we're trying to expand the project and develop it, etc. And I just think if some of those logics of these kind of binaries stay there, like center, periphery, somewhere, anywhere, even, all these, like for me, it was useless, useful. I'm trying to smash these logics. I don't want them, because the proof is in the pudding that, you know, people are coming and saying, we need this. So really, like, my question is like, what is the needs that we're trying to address in all these activities that we're doing? And for me, that's where these questions of code switch and kind of trying to subvert the ambassador's model of how we show art. Sorry, I got excited, but like, it means a lot to me that this happened.
No, that was brilliant. And on that note, I will draw us to a close. Thank you so much. And I am really sorry to those of you who put questions in the Q&A. We'll be able to sort of weave some of those into the discussion in the next session as well. And thank you so much to Roger and Francis and Emma and Abbas, and of course to Hammad and Alice and Marlene for their questions as well. Thank you so much. And let's reconvene in about 10 minutes, so at a quarter to the hour for our next section. So thank you so much, everybody. I'll see you soon.
Thank you.
So in this session, what we'll be doing, as you can see here in this little on the slide, is we're going to hear two proposition or provocation papers from our presenters, Wing Chan and Zara Jumapoy. And these are responses to our to an open call that we set out, inviting people to respond to these key questions. To start us off, we have Wing Chan joining us. But Wing Chan is currently studying an MRes art exhibition studies at Central St. Martin's University of the Arts, London. Her research focuses on 1980s and 1990s Hong Kong art. Long distance communication is one of her inspirations. She was editor at MCCM Creations, an independent art press in Hong Kong, and specialized in bilingual visual culture books. She's currently based in London, where she also moonlights as a translator for artist monographs and projects related to autodidactic artists. This paper focuses on the touring exhibition, The Art of Henry Moore, Sculptures, Drawings, and Graphics from 1921 to 1984 in Hong Kong, which took place in Hong Kong in 1986, to consider how Moore was presented and perceived differently in the UK and in Hong Kong at that time. She'll guide us through a little recognized 24-minute documentary on the exhibition that was broadcasted in Hong Kong to investigate how the power relations at that time, after the signing of the Sino-British Joint Declaration, are mediated visually. By capturing the movement of colossal objects, the monumentality of Moore's works were translated into Britain's national strength. Produced by Radio Television Hong Kong, the documentary is, Wing will argue, where UK's national image met locally rooted skepticism and optimism alike. So Wing, I invite you to pop your video on, and I believe you're going to share your screen.
Hello.
Oh, there you are.
Good to see you introducing me, and thank Hammad for having me here. I'm going to tell a story of Henry Moore exhibition in Hong Kong and suggest that touring exhibitions are sites not only for Britain to assert power visually, but also for other players to stage intervention point reception. My case study is the 1986 exhibition titled The Art of Henry Moore, Sculptures, Drawings, and Graphics, 1921 to 1984, brought to Hong Kong by the British Council and sponsored by American Express as part of the Hong Kong Arts Festival. For my presentation, I'll be showing still images from the exhibition documentary produced by RTHK, Radio Television Hong Kong. The documentary was broadcast in Hong Kong after the exhibition. Some context about the city. Hong Kong is almost 6,000 miles from the UK. The city is known for being one of the world's busiest trading ports. In 1986, Hong Kong was still a British colony. Just 2 years prior to that, the Sino-British Joint Declaration was signed between Britain and China to confirm the end of British colonial rule by 1997. What I'm trying to stress is that the mid-1980s was a very specific period when the two countries, Britain and China, were negotiating. They had a desire to demonstrate their national power to each other through Hong Kong. It's against this political and colonial background that the Henry Moore exhibition was held. The 86 exhibition is interesting because it resists the notion of practicality of traveling light. On the screen here is a demonstration of traveling light. It's a work of art called Flying Elephant, created by the late Hong Kong sculptor Antonio Mack after the Moore show. An elephant that's made firm, that flies in the air. I'll come back to this image towards the end of the presentation. In contrast, the 1986 Henry Moore touring exhibition in Hong Kong suggests an alternative rule of traveling. That is, the bigger and heavier the work, the further it travels. It might sound counterintuitive in this moment, but I hope it will make sense to you as we go. A brief idea about the general measurements of the exhibits in the show. The lengthiest sculpture is captured here. It measures more than 10 meters. It's a fiberglass recast of the work, large reclining figure, displayed on the promenade of Hong Kong. It's so long that the video frame cannot capture it properly. The form is highly distorted here. The heaviest sculpture is this bronze work, three-piece reclining figure, draped, displayed on the other side of the harbor in Edinburgh Square. It's more than 4 meters long and weighs almost 5 tons. Transporting monumental objects across national borders symbolizes capital, the financial power that made this transmission possible, but it's also a demonstration of national strength, in this case, the national power of Britain. Flashback to the 1940s UK helps us better understand this situation. Back then, Henry Moore already transformed himself from an artist to a representative of British art within Britain. Qualities associated with him were, and still are, post-war and Britain's humanistic and democratic vision. And that had everything to do with the UK Labour government's social and cultural policies in the mid-1940s. They introduced the welfare state, increased public funding for culture, and democratized the appreciation of modern art to nurture post-war citizenship. It was a time when Britain started to have state-funded art council, state-supported patronage, and exhibitions. Moore was particularly vocal about the social responsibility of sculptors in post-war reconstruction. This attitude matched the Arts Council's aspirations and gave him access to state-supported opportunities. A key example is in 1951, is this 1951 Festival of Britain in London. Arts Festival commissioned Moore to produce this bronze work, large reclining figure. The festival became a decisive moment that Moore's work, especially for the oversized one, they were elevated from modernist sculptures to an emblem of nationhood. To answer the core question of what stories of British art travel, I propose that since the 1940s, Moore and his work have been representing the ideal profile of Britain that's associated with humanistic and democratic vision. It's about citizenship and civilization. And that made him a cultural ambassador to present Britain abroad. Meanwhile, the physical dimension of his work also contribute to this British identity. If we consider how size and scale correlate with our imagination of the powerful. By the 1980s, Black arts movement and feminism were already mature in Britain. Moore's position as a white male artist representing British national ideal abroad ought to be rethought. It's also in the middle of Thatcherism, where public funding for culture was drastically cut. But Moore's solo touring exhibitions only went bigger. The British Council started touring Henry Moore's exhibition in Europe in the 1940s and Asia since the late 1950s. That's why his solo exhibition traveled to Hong Kong time and again in 1965, 1970, 1974, and lastly, 1986. But the 86 exhibition is unique. The tension between Britain and China over the sovereignty of Hong Kong took effect in the society in the form of a mass migration wave. People in Hong Kong were anxious about the future, distrust both sides, and distrust British and Chinese government at the same time, and tried to find an escape route to relocate elsewhere. A modernist and humanist position of Britain as a nation manifest by more in Hong Kong was thus crucial and urgent. So after 12 years, more was sent to Hong Kong again. British power must be demonstrated visually and read by the widest possible general public in Hong Kong, not just the art circle. It's a mission that only large-sized sculptures such as Moore's were capable of performing. Moore's artwork were displayed in 7 locations in Hong Kong, including museum, art center, and several popular public space, a scale that's unheard of even for now. 307 exhibits were shown, 168 of them were sculptures, many were oversized and monumental pieces. It was said to be the largest modern sculpture exhibition in Asia till then. The documentary feeds us with all these images of cargoes, planes, and helicopters, telling us how Moore's mega artworks were transported through mega machines. A cargo named Hamburg Express from England experienced a storm. In Singapore, another former British colony, unluckily arrived in Hong Kong on the 13th of January, 1984, just 2 weeks before the exhibition. Then individual sculptures were further transported by helicopters across the Victoria Harbour to various exhibition venues. The process involved coordination of the building development department, lands department, marine department, Royal Hong Kong Police Force, Royal Air Force, and Joint Air Tasking Cell, British forces. In the still images, we see British flag, gigantic pieces of sculpture, Royal Air Force helicopter, and local people a little bit scared by the helicopters in the middle. I wanted to show that the 86 Henry Motoring exhibition in Hong Kong was impressive as a political project through logistics, as it was an art show. The strategy is tied to Hong Kong's unique position as one of the world's busiest trading ports, as well as a promise of freedom and democracy inscribed in the Sino-British Joint Declaration in 1984. By no chance a coincidence, an exhibition publicity also emphasizes that the curatorial planning began in 1984. Sorry, it's a previous slide. By no chance a coincidence, the exhibition publicity also emphasizes that the curatorial planning began in 1984. You can see on the screen here, there's a shared emphasis on the free movement of objects between the 86 Moore exhibition and the 84 Joint Declaration. The Sino-British Joint Declaration states that after the handover, Hong Kong will retain its own political and economic system for 50 years, including the free movement of goods and capital. The performing quality of moving Moore's large and heavy sculptures is a performance of freedom, echoing the humanistic position associated with British national identity. However, it's only a partial story. At the beginning of the presentation, I suggest that during the exhibition, are also sites for other players to stage interventions upon reception. And RTHK, the producer of the video, is one of them. In the 1980s, RTHK was a department of the colonial government, but enjoyed a certain degree of autonomy in the editorial. The programming was singularly positioned with its access to governmental information, as well as being highly respected by Hong Kong residents. The exhibition documentary is therefore where Britain's national image met locally rooted skepticism. Honest feedback on more sculptures from the public were captured and built into the documentary. And I think it's a very important moment because it really opened up another layer of the narrative. Then Dr. Ho made appearance as the only voice of local authority. He assimilated Moore's abstraction to oracle bone scripts, the earliest known form of Chinese writing rooted in the history of China. So these are the scripts. And it can be seen as a way to challenge the version of British nationhood circulated abroad through Henry Moore to tell a different type of belonging. And I would like to end this presentation by showing you Antonio Mark's Flying Elephants again to speculate the response from practicing artists in Hong Kong. In October 1987, around a year and a half after the Moore exhibition, 21 Hong Kong artists staged a weekend show called Out of Contest in the colonial styles mentioned. The artists released a manifesto to protest against the lack of institutional support to their art practice. They did not target at the recent Moore exhibition, but artists must have recognized its symbolic meaning and the enormous public and private wealth that made the touring exhibition possible. Antonio Mark's signature works are bronze sculptures that represent human body and animals. But for Out of Contact, he made this rather playful, unexpected move to produce a soft elephant sculpture. The way that this work was suspended from the ceiling not only reminds us how Moore's sculptures flew across Hong Kong's harbor through Royal Air Force helicopters, but also turns the promise of movement into a satire. We wonder if it's an artificial journey in synthetic material. I see this example as Hong Kong artists' very witty commentary on the 86 Henry Moore touring exhibition. And I think it's a good place to stop here. Thank you.
Oh, that was fantastic. Thank you so much, Wing. I think you really picked up the balls that were in the air when we finished our panel and are sort of carrying them forward for us. And again, I'm really looking forward to asking you some questions in our conversation. But before we get to that, it is my delight to introduce our second and final sort of proposal provocation paper, which will be given to us by Dr. Zara Jumahoy. Zara is a UK-based art historian specializing in modern and contemporary South Asian art. She was the Stephen and Elena Hines Scholar at the Courtauld, where she completed her doctorate and has lectured on undergraduate and postgraduate programs. She is currently a visiting lecturer at various academic institutions in the UK and elsewhere, including contributing to various modules for the MA in Asian Art Histories at LaSalle College of the Arts in Singapore. In 2018, she co-curated the exhibition, The Progressive Revolution, A Modern Art for a New India, at New York's Asia Society Museum. She is now curatorial research fellow at Glenvivian Art Gallery in Swansea, a position funded by the Paul Mellon Centre for British Art. And I believe it's from that context that this paper is going to be given today. So this paper takes up Sir Frank Brangman's British Empire panels in Swansea's Guildhall to rethink the trend in current scholarship around its 16 paintings to sidestep the moral implications of their context. Using new archival evidence, Zara will argue that the conflicting opinions the panels have spawned, pride in Swansea's imperial contributions on the one hand and shock at their misplaced romanticism on the other, expose the complexities of Wales' relationship to British imperialism, sitting uneasily within the narratives of Britishness and empire, despite their apparent lauding of both. And so on that note, I'm really looking forward to hearing this. Over to you, Sarah.
So I feel in different ways. Well, I always feel like a bit of an imposter, but I definitely feel like a bit of an imposter on this particular panel, and I'll tell you why. So in some ways, the question for me is not which British artists travel, but rather which British artists have been traveling, but are not necessarily fully integrated into the dialogue of Britishness in the first place. And so, you know, Frank Branwyn is both white and male, and yet, I will argue, has been systematically sidelined within narratives of modern British art. And I think what I want to show with this particular example is twofold. Firstly, that there are particular narratives in terms of the modern and how it has been conceived within British art history that are things that we need to challenge and unpick. That's the first thing. And then the second thing is to argue that Britishness in itself, and perhaps the very notion of a British art, is composed of many other kinds of national identities. And that not only is Britishness not a sort of self-evident, cohesive category, but actually the fun part about Britishness is that it's not. It's got contradictory dialogues, they don't hang together, and they are, at most exciting times, at war within themselves. And I particularly enjoy this kind of war. And I will end on showing you why I'm really kind of excited by this question of where Welshness fits into British narratives, because part of what I want to do with like my own research and what the Glenvivian and I have been like working towards with an exhibition called Imperial Subjects and all the sort of different things that build up into it, is actually looking at you know, equivalences about what gets left out of narratives of British art. And that, of course, for me, is always also has to do with South Asia. So I'm starting with this sort of, with lots of images, and I'm not going to linger too much on them, but I'll give you a few little spicy anecdotes and a very delicious quote. So this is a Frank Brangman panel that I will sort of refer to very briefly right at the end of my talk. So I just want you to look at it quite closely now. And it's called The Printed Word Makes People of One World by Sir Frank Branwyn. Okay, and it's a mural. Okay, so here is an archival photograph of Frank Branwyn painting the famous British Empire panels. And I have to say that this particular presentation is one that I have prepared by working very closely with the Glenvivian Art Gallery, but particularly with the archivist Ellie Dawson, also referred to as by me and others as Genius Ellie. And so Ellie has sort of helped dig out a lot of the archival material that you're going to be seeing today. And this particular bit of archival material was Ellie and me being helped by Tom Bilson at the Courtauld, who dragged up this picture, and there are many, many more like it. So I mean, part of what we're going to be doing with this project is actually like, you know, exploring this amazing archive of 8 volumes that are all at the Whit Conway Library. This is what the panels look like now. So we asked for a picture from Swansea Council of how they are in situ, so you can just have a quick look. It's not a great way of seeing the panels in this picture, so I'm giving you close-ups as well. And soon you will be getting close-ups. Okay, so Sir Frank Branwyn born in 1867. He was born in Belgium and died in his home in England. But Brangman's ancestry was Welsh from both sides. This heritage is responsible for the presence of Brangman's British Empire panels in Swansea's Guildhall. Brangman is now considered an Anglo-Welsh artist, according to Wiki, but as we will see, it was not always thus. Brangman was a painter, a watercolorist, an engraver, an illustrator, and a progressive designer. He produced designs for stained glass, furniture, ceramics, tableware, building, and interior, and was a lithographer, woodcutter, and a book illustrator. Some of these smattering of things I will actually be showing, especially when it relates to the panels. So during his lifetime, Brangman produced over 12,000 artworks. His mural commissions alone covered 22,000 square feet of canvas. In other words, he was prolific. And as the art historian Peter Duffy would have it, I quote, "In 1918, Brangman was almost certainly the most famous artist in the world. One indication," says Duffy, I'm still quoting, "of his standing in the British and international art world can be demonstrated by the fact that from 1905 to 1907, he was responsible for the design and for the decoration, including the murals, gallery wall surfaces, and the furniture of the British Pavilion of the Venice Biennale. Between 1897 and 1936, he exhibited at that Biennale 10 times. So my question to you is, how come we don't really know anything about him? So the Empire panels comprise 17 monumental paintings, are popularly, especially in Wales, considered to be the prolific Brangman's most significant achievement. But they have a checkered history. And I am using them in this talk to show that Brangman himself had a checkered inclusion in the narrative of British art. The British Empire panels are pivotal to understanding Brangman's complex positioning within this narrative. So the panels were initially commissioned for the Royal Gallery in the House of Lords. And as the current Swansea Council website makes clear, they were hotly pursued by both Cardiff and Swansea when they got rejected. The ensuing battle ended with Swansea City Council winning the bid to house them in 1934, raising the Guildhall ceiling to 13.4 meters in order to accommodate them. So the current Swansea Council site for the Guildhall states, Sir Frank Brangman is celebrated as one of Britain's most prolific and versatile artists. The story of the Brangman panels and the various fascinating preparatory drawings coming to Swansea is one of triumph over disaster. So I'm still quoting now. Both Cardiff and Swansea showed interest. Due to Brangman's considerable fame and his paternal Welsh connections, Brangman Hall was inaugurated along with the whole building by the then Duke of Kent. And then various royals are also mentioned coming to open Brangman Hall. And we are told it is a continuing source of interest today. And it is. But I also want to give you a slightly different history. So the celebratory official narrative surrounding their arrival and display, and here you can see with what pomp and glee, actually, it made me cry a little bit reading this. So this is another thing that Ellie has discovered from the archives, are these press clippings of the Brangman panels arriving in Swansea. They cost 20,000, it is said in sort of like in capital letters in one of these press clippings. And over here, they very much presented as having been sort of saved. You know, America wanted them for 40,000, but no, it was refused. And safely they are coming to Swansea's new Guildhall. So there was great excitement about their arrival. However, my other narrative, and here they are being installed. And here is a little view of the panels themselves. So, notwithstanding the celebrated official narrative surrounding their arrival and display, the panels were dogged with controversy from the start. The House of Lords' reasons for rejecting them in 1930, here's your delicious quote coming, has to do with the preponderance of tits and bananas. So do see the bananas. Tits coming later. So the Earl of Crawford, who chaired the Fine Art Commission, styled it to the Daily News. Just imagine 5 feet long bananas. In a room like this, with its historic association, these new pictures might do very well for a nightclub, but they're certainly out of place here. So there's some subject matter, think of the bare body servile positions ascribed to natives, hardly sit comfortably with current sensibilities either. Nonetheless, so far, art historical scholarship has glossed over the traumatic birth of Brangman's panels, simultaneously sidestepping the moral implications of their content. This paper seeks to reverse this trend, focusing on both. I argue that Brangman's murals lay bare, some pun intended, his fraught relationship with empire, as well as the ideas of modern British art. And I will show you how and why this makes them extremely pivotal and important to discussions about decolonizing art history today. And I'm also going to show you that this is not a narrative of, let's get rid of them. Absolutely not. It's a narrative of let's look closely at them and let's look closely at the alternative histories that they actually show us. And of course, like I always say, my personal motto is when in doubt, blame the Tate. And so I will be doing a little bit about that when it comes to discussions about definitions of modernity and modern British art. And I will show you how Brangman has been left out of that particular categorization and the implications for what that actually means. So, but right now I'm sort of looking at, so here's your quote, no tits and bananas, but it's the same Lord who sort of castigated them in this way. And he talks about them sort of not coming to the royal halls at in the House of Lords, because, if the ceiling is done over new, as the sample suggests, it will look like that of a bathroom. Okay, so, right, here's Brangman. Another picture from the Whit and Conway Library. So comparisons with Tate's current, issues to do with decolonization and Black Lives Matter and murals seem to be in order. And how can one help but notice that the bare bodies ascribed to the female natives in the panels, in the light of Black Lives Matter and the urgent need to decolonize the past, young activist Stevie McKinnon Smith was one of many who raised their voices in 2020. And McKinnon Smith insists, and I agree with her, that this past needs to be properly accounted for. And particularly in the light of White Pube's protests about the Tate's displays. I'm not going to go any further in that direction, because what I want to argue is, yes, indeed, we do need to account for this, and this narrative has to be embodied on the walls alongside the murals, but that does not mean that their own angle into British art history should be ignored either. And I think there's some very interesting dialogues that actually come to the fore if we look at them. So now that's exactly what we're going to do. So here I'm showing you a little bit about Brangman in his studio with Frank Alford from Neath, which is where I come from, which is like 15 minutes away from Swansea. And part of what we're doing at the Glenvivian is also looking at the Welsh connections of Brangman. And this is something that, in his definitions as a British artist, or sometimes the Wikipedia entry entry and other entries have even called him an English artist, do quite a lot to sort of gloss over. So this reinscribing of, you know, what were the Welsh connections, were they any? And it seems quite a fruitful dialogue to have, because, you know, Ellie and I looking have found, and this is what Ellie noticed, is Frank Alford, who was one of his assistants, actually comes from Neath. And there are a whole series of sort of interventions into Wales throughout his career. Again, this is drawing upon not just Ellie's archives, but a fantastic art historian who did her PhD on Brangman called Libby Horner. However, the sort of idea that Brangman ought to be celebrated as a Welsh artist, particularly because of the panels, is not something that has, you know, that it is not it's something that seems obvious, but at the same time, you also have an alternative narrative that has held sway a lot in art history. And this is the narrative. Peter Lord, a self-styled Welsh art historian, he is an art historian of Welsh art. Yes, he isn't Welsh. But Peter Lord says, most unusually, this exhibition, and now he's talking about an exhibition that took place in the turn of the century, which happened in Wales and included Brangman. And this is what he has to say. It included an important work by R.T. Rhys Griffiths, but he says it also showed painters included Sir Frank Brangman. Born in Belgium to a Welsh mother, his career and work had little relevance to Wales. But his status in the English art world made him attractive to those who sought to elevate the idea of Welsh art in the early 20th century. As a result, he was frequently referred to in Wales as a Welsh artist. So this kind of narrative very much leaves Brangman out of any kind of definition of what Welsh art might be. This is some of the things that you know, I really want to probe and look at a little further as to why this. But I also, here I'm showing you what the British Empire panels would have looked like, at least 5 of them, when they were put up in the House of Lords, and in order for them to be sort of looked at, and then they were rejected. And finally, as we know, they have come to Swansea. But other than looking at, you know, and acknowledging the content of them, and some of the rehabilitation dialogues about them, for instance, by art historian called Alan Powers, has been to sort of give the House of Lords, as it were, more of a sense of PC-ness than I believe they actually had, which is that the reason that they might have been rejected was because, you know, because Gandhi had actually had his march in 1924, and people were a lot more liberal, as it were, about, you know, the presentation of empire. But I would contest that. I don't think it was a PC-ness. I do think that there were other things at play over here, which was also to do with the fact that Brangman was just not really fashionable and within the definitions of the modern at that time. And I'll show you a little bit more about that. But one of the things I do want to look at very briefly is the context in which he makes the British Empire panels, which then get rejected, especially according to Swansea Council, the website, as they, you know, their version of why they were rejected was that they were too colorful. I do want to look at the fact that, you know, these panels were produced because it was the second time that Brangman's commission had been rejected. So the first time that Brangman produced, so here's a close-up of some of the panels. And this is the first commission. So the first time Lord Ivey at the House of Lords commissioned Brangman to you know, sort of produce murals, this is what Brangman comes up with: A Tank in Action being one of them. And these murals talk very much about the war. They're very influenced by vorticism, and it's thought, and which is why they're kind of rejected, is that they were much too dark. So the idea being, when Lord Ivey goes back to him, he says, well, don't make it so dark. I know what we are going to do is we're going to celebrate the British Empire. And so the brief switches from a war commission to being about the British Empire. And so one of the sort of excuses that you can make, and I think it's a fair and a genuine one, is that, at first Brangman is told this is much too dark, and then he is told this is much too colorful. And part of what I'm seeing here is that even though narratives around Brangman at this point, talk about him as a highly celebrated establishment figure, when it actually comes down to these kinds of commissions, Brangman is always more famous as a British artist outside Britain than he is within Britain. He's always just that little bit out of any kind of mainstream validation that could happen for him. And it's interesting that these murals also finally end up in Wales, and they're bought by Cardiff. And this, in a way, fits an entire pattern of sort of the claiming of Brangman by Wales, because in the case of the Welsh Museum, they already had a sort of active interest. National Museum Wales in Cardiff already had an active interest, because Brangman made this painting for them called The Entry of the Welsh Troops into Jerusalem. And this is also part of what I'm arguing, that there is more of a connection with Wales that can be explored. On the one hand, but there is also a sense in which also a sense in which that Brangman struggles for sort of an overarching British recognition, but then he always ends up landing with a Welsh one. And this is exactly the pattern that is followed by the British Empire panels. So here I'm sort of taking you on a slight detour, but I will come back and wrap it all up very quickly, because I know that I'm taking a bit long. Is what I'm going to show you now is some of the influences that go into a creation of a Brangman, and that these influences and narratives that Brangman represents actually show us quite a lot about British art at that time, and show us quite a lot about the way in which multiple narratives of international and cultural trajectories come together in a work like the Empire panels, and that if we don't give them their due, if we don't look at them, the issue is that there's a whole kind of narrative of Britishness and modernity that is ignored, and this is particularly the narrative that we should not be ignoring today, because it's a multicultural one. It's one that struggles for reaching out to different cultural trajectories. And so here I'm giving you a very few examples of the Brangman influences that very much come from William Morris, with whom he was an apprentice from 1882 to 84. And as you can see by looking at the Morris and Co tapestry, that these and the sort of the trellis work here with William Morris, that this is one of the histories that the Brangman panels are actually mining. The other thing that we're also talking about in terms of sort of a very plural look on the construction of imagery is also the sort of slightly orientalist, yes, tone of Morris's iconography. And this is exactly the sort of thing that Brangman is drawing on. And again, I just wanted to give you a little bit of an India thing of how the panels are constructed out of these studies that are made both from London Zoo, but also from Brangman, unlike William Morris, who didn't really like to travel. Brangman loved to travel. And for him, all of these different travels forged their way into his work, which was, he didn't make a distinction between fine art painting easel painting, and the decorative art. So it was a much more holistic look at kind of the arts and crafts movement. And it also had, of course, a very sort of culturally porous angle to it, perhaps much more than William Morris. And so—
Sorry, Sarah, can I just, can we start wrapping it up? Maybe?
Yeah, okay, I'm sorry. Yeah, I'll do that. So the last bit that I kind of wanted to look at is actually Brangman's collaborations, which you can also see within the panels themselves and the iconography with the Japanese artist and woodblock maker Urushi Bara. And so the kind of, I just wanted to stress the arts and crafts tradition. And then this is my sort of like end point. So my end point being is that if you look at the sort of trajectory of the modern and what it's been allowed to sort of exhibit, someone like Peter Duffy makes a really interesting point that the Tate's definition of the modern, and here he uses an example of Wyndham Lewis, a Wyndham Lewis work being offered to Tate, specifically under John Rothenstein's curatorship, and that was like directorship, which was 26 years. And, you know, the fate of a Brangman in contrast. And what Duffy argues is that the modern that is privileged within narratives of British art are exactly the sort of you know, Henry Moore. It's exactly the kind of Wyndham Lewis take on the formal, slightly more abstract properties of separating the fine art from the decorative. And so that in a sense, the fall guy, as it were, is somebody like Brangman. And I'm just giving you a very, maybe I won't. Quote where he actually talks about, you know, Rothenstein's decisions are so final that, you know, if Brangman and Orpen have been excluded from that narrative of the modern, that exclusion continues to this day. And yeah, so, and here is William Morris getting a nice big kick in about Brangman-esque bubbles on the surface of the abstract, and he hates Fry's belated little Morris, and of course Brangman too is following that same arts and crafts trajectory. And this is where I really want to end, because what I'm trying to say is that if we rehabilitate looking at Brangman at these panels, what we can also do is get an entire angle into the way in which contemporary artists who are Black or who are South Asian actually find you know, equivalences where they draw on the Morrisian past, and that's where they construct their language from very often. And so in fact, it is this angle of the modern that deserves to be re-looked at, and that's exactly what I want to do with the Brangman. And here's Rakib Shaw making all the equivalences on the wall here, including with William Morris's little patterns that I just did with Brangman. And so that's it.
Thank you so much, Sarah. And I'm sorry to you and anybody else that I've had to today. Unlike in a normal conference, you can't do this sort of very quiet sort of 5 minutes. It's all a bit sort of in your face, so I apologize. So what I'd like to do now is to start to sort of digest some of what we've heard today. That has been so interesting. And there have been so many interesting connections you made. So I'd like to invite those of you who are here from the first session, Roger and Emma and Abbas, to pop your videos on if you'd like, and join in with a sort of wider discussion now. So I think actually what I'd like to do is sort of start off almost where we ended before our break. So I think, Zara, in your paper, you make this really interesting point about, you know, that connects directly to Alice's question, I think, before the break, about what Britishness is and how we relate this sort of nebulous thing that is Britishness with its constituent, the constituent countries of the UK, and where Welshness, where Scottishness, where Northern Irishness come into play in a Britishness that can't mean a de facto, or maybe it always means, or sometimes means, or often means a de facto Englishness. I was wondering, Emma, if you might want to sort of to link together the two panels a little bit and draw on your experience with the British Council with dealing with.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Just going back to that question about British Pavilion in Venice, and I think it obviously Moore and Brangwyn are also deeply connected with that history. So it's wonderful to be hearing both of your presentations today. Actually, it's I've really found it quite thrilling. I think, if as you probably both know, the history of the British Pavilion is vastly and predominantly white, male and English. And yet it is called the British Pavilion. And obviously that is, the history of the artists who've exhibited in it. And that is obviously problematic. And I think in response to that, post-2000, Northern Ireland, Scotland and Wales started to create their own pavilions. And in fact, a colleague of mine from the British Council was instrumental as country director in Scotland in encouraging the Scottish Pavilion to exist. And I'm pleased to say that when we showed Cathy Wilkes back in 2019, she was, as far as we can tell, because we don't know about the records from before the British Council took over, but what we can tell, that was the first time that a sort of self-declaredly Northern Irish artist certainly had a solo exhibition representing the UK. And it was certainly the first time for a long time that a Scottish artist had that particular position. I think even going all the way back to Paolozzi. So, quite an extraordinary gap there. And I won't even go on to talking about, the history of Welsh artists. They are there, but, the documentation for sometimes these questions of identity are also quite challenging. So it's sometimes hard to actually know who was there. Also, this whole question is sort of English privilege in naming. So I just wanted to quote an exhibition that the British Council did in 1953, which was called British Art Today, 10 English painters. And they were all men. 2 of them were Scottish, McBride and Paolozzi. So I'm sure that there are many other occasions, certainly in the history of the British Council's exhibition making, in which that has happened. But I'm glad to see it's got a smile from Hammad. That's all from me.
That's remarkable, really, isn't it? That's just really thrown me, sorry. But I think there's something really interesting there, and I was thinking about it in the first panel, and also in this one about who claims what, and what happens when an artist claims, an identity, and conversely, what happens when a nation claims an artist. And so in that light, I think, Zara, I'd like to sort of kick it back over to you to think, to what extent has Brangwyn has his art history unfolded within a British context? Is he just sort of totally marginalized?
Well, how many people here had actually heard about him?
That's actually big, yeah.
Yeah, so I mean, I think so. And I mean, I think the larger point is also that you know, it's questions to do with the modern and which history he fits into. So is it a modern British history? In which case, what happens to the arts and crafts movement? You know, William Morris is very easy to slot into design, particularly because he kind of makes a lot of comments about the non-modern. What's interesting about Branwyn is that in every side of the narrative, he seems to want to belong to it, and so he does define himself as modern, and he's quite happy to be, you know, a British artist. It's just that on every side of all dialogues, you know, he's either too establishment or not quite establishment enough, and that is what is interesting. Is that when you're not even quite sure which history you would put him in. And I also think what's fascinating is that we do need to look at definitions of the modern per se, and not just in terms of British art, but just in terms of what kind of things are allowed in an art historical place, and what things are suddenly, you know, are only really allowed within a space that is decorative, that is design, and it's not a sort of, it's not a past leaning issue to debate the modern, because what I found really fascinating is a lot of the criticisms that are leveled against contemporary South Asian artists, particularly when they do very well and become too commercial, too Disney, too establishment, is that the damning with not faint praise, but with high honors, is to call them too decorative. And so, you know, that too decorative, pejorative term, which is associated with a kind of Orientalism, which has been disgraced, I think it's worth picking that apart a little bit, which doesn't mean that we take over, you know, hook, line, and sinker, you know, a William Morris aesthetic, or that we don't probe the question of Orientalism. It's just that maybe there's another way of looking at it too.
And perhaps that could be also connected with contemporary practices. And I was just thinking with the example that you left us in the first panel with, Abbas, where you know, to use your terms about code switching, where contemporary art is now going to be platformed in a neurologist's conference. You're just thinking about, you know, these disciplines which are not being respected by contemporary artists, and thinking about the arts and craft movement as just an example of that, or if you like, that's its history that's perhaps not acknowledged or not reflected. And I wonder how you would think about something like that.
Yeah, I mean, for me, I try to maintain a sense of diversity within my own practice, and I think, you know, when you know, so from exhibition making to these kind of, you know, recently I'm doing a mail commission. It's a mail art that goes out on seeded paper and people plant it in their homes, and you know, from kind of the community organizing kind of social practice, where for many years I hosted a philosophy symposium in my local fish and chip shop. You know, it's kind of like, for me, that kind of emblematic institution of the fish and chip takeaway, or this kind of space, became like really relevant, and so, you know, that's these kind of I like it when things intersect in this way, to me, and again, that's why I think I have this commonality with Marlene's perspective from before as well. You know, this kind of idea of Britishness that's rooted in a kind of experience of migration, or the migratory aspects of our culture, because that's really that's really the conditions out of which this idea of code switching comes from. It's funny. I was speaking to a sociologist friend of mine, and they paused to remark that I speak with an accent that is defined in their discourse as multicultural London English, MLE, because every so often I dip in and out of patois or some other kind of slang, and for me, it's just how I talk. If I'm in this context, I make sure that I'm not dipping too much into the slang, but every so often it might kind of be the only way I can express a certain thing, and then someone might hear that in the audience, and etc., and that creates a kind of a particular kind of connection that they may understand. So the code switch is really this idea of accepting that there is no universal language, there is no universal discourse, there is no high and low. There is only these kind of different modes that we try to inhabit and kind of explore together. And when I think about even this idea of what it means to be contemporary, I'm reminded of what I think it was Hito Steyel. She said that contemporary is about asynchronicity. This idea that there is no there is no longer a defined period. And for me, even when I go to the root of that word contemporary, it means contempo, it means with the time and not necessarily of a time. So anything can be contemporary. If I have an interest in, the writings of Abu Hamid al-Ghazali from the medieval Islamic period, this can be a contemporary concern within a particular context that we are discussing today. And I think one of the texts that never really gets referenced in terms of how groundbreaking it is the book Cyclonopedia by Reza Negarestani. And this is a book which is discussed as theory fiction, and it's claimed that Reza is the founder of this kind of type of writing which is between philosophy and literature. However, the defining feature of this text is that it's really coming out of a particular kind of migratory experience, and really kind of reframes the Middle East in this very interesting kind of way, which builds upon ideas around kind of contemporary philosophy, especially like post-structuralist thinking, and also kind of literary phenomena such as like magical realism. So for me, like a text like that, if you pick it up in any age, you cannot define when this text was written. It's really like anyone from any era could pick this text up and think it's addressing them in their own time. And I think this is really the challenge of what I feel like is the kind of work that I kind of expect to see now from within a British context is something that, because we have this mixture and this what we have in the past referred to as multiculturalism, and this diversity between the provinces and the cities and all these kind of different assemblages and multiplicities that we can so easily dip in and out of within this context, which has a history of this kind of relationships through its colonies and the empire and those types of expansionist mindsets, which as I mentioned is in this ambassador's painting. That's something that's very different in terms of our position in Europe versus like say the US, for example. This kind of both vertical and horizontal kind of mixture of things that we can dip in and out of, I think it really forces us to think like, how can we go beyond even this notion of contemporary into something that is kind of asynchronous. I don't know how to say the word, but we're not really trying to define something in time. And I think sometimes with this call to kind of represent something, that kind of logic of representation, it's really about a kind of a time-based logic of kind of how do we define Britain now, or like, and it's about, for me, it's again a kind of trying to, that idea of encoding and switching an exhibition into a support space. I mean, who's going to argue that exhibitions are support spaces? It kind of, that's a timeless thing. You go to the Ottoman hospitals, they have concert halls attached to the hospital. There's like, this is a medieval practice. So for me, it's not necessarily like I've made a discovery that art can heal. It's kind of dipping in and out of things and reframing them in the ways that are necessary and kind of honoring the legacies that put us here in the first place. That's how I see it. And so every kind of creative movement, and non-creative movements. That's why I think this scientific kind of alliance that I've been fortunate to be a part of is really key, because it's kind of opening up the idea of art into this much more porous way of even addressing what is a sort of institutional space. Yeah, so I'll just leave it there.
Oh, sorry. Thank you. That was really interesting. And actually it brought, in my mind, it brought me to Wing, to your paper, and this idea of, I love the way you put it. I'm just gonna, this idea of being with, not of time, and the ways in which that Henry Moore exhibition, yeah, it's, you know, an assertion of power, but also it has a real sort of powerful political and aesthetic impact in its own right. You know what I mean? That sort of puts it into the realm of that sort of contemporary political action. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about that, the ways in which it was contextualized in Hong Kong and its relationship to history and to modernism even, or the history of modernism in that context.
And sorry, could I throw in my 2 cents on that as well, Wing? Because when you were talking through that and just thinking about more recent artist projects in Hong Kong, thinking in particular about Anthony Gormley, so another sort of sculptor, white male in the city, huge, you know, very, very sort of distinct and obvious presence. Or when Thomas Heatherwick was trying to, you know, was visiting Hong Kong repeatedly to raise sort of funds for the Garden Bridge. And I wondered if there is, as you think about even just those 3 examples, that sphere of the political and the commercial and those relationships of power between Britain, Hong Kong, or Hong Kong as a sort of mediation between sort of China and Britain. Yeah, maybe there's far too many questions in here, but really I was interested in as to how you're applying that lens of art to look at those relationships. And at that time in 84, 86, and perhaps how, if you apply those lenses again to more recent works, how would your sort of analysis change?
It's a really big question to answer. But when I look at this exhibition in 1986, I found it impossible to not look at it through the filter of the colonial history at that time, especially because when I look at this documentary produced by RTHK and I try to compare it with the one that was produced by a Japanese producer, NHK, because what I did not say is that Turin exhibition, Hong Kong was the first stop, and then Japan, and then India in the following year. And then when I compared these 2 documentaries, I can see NHK, the Japanese version, it really put Henry Moore within art history. They talk about him as a modernist sculptor. And then within the documentary, they also invite the sculptors, they invite Japanese art critics into the discussion. And then the image will all focus on, for example, a close-up shot of the face or the hand gesture of those sculptures. But in contrast, the Hong Kong documentary definitely focus on how those works were transported, and those pictures that I show about mega machines, cargoes, helicopter, Royal Air Force. And that's how I find the threat to be unable to not look at it through colonialism and also capitalism as well. And at that time, the competition between Britain and China, it's also capitalism and a communist China as well. And Hammad, your following up question is?
Maybe I was, with just one example, thinking about the Anthony Gormley sort of sculptures that were also placed in the city, and how you maybe compared that to something that took place 30 years earlier. Don't worry, we can always come back to it.
And I'm sorry, because I'm thinking about the scale is so different. It made me feel a little bit hard to switch to that comparison.
Marlene, did you want to jump in there?
Yeah, and forgive me if this is a bit naughty, but I kind of want to push that question back to Hammad, really, in terms of, yeah, I'm kind of interested whether behind that question there might be a position that you have yourself, in thinking about those two examples.
That is naughty, Marlene, but I will try and respond. And I was really struck by, I think, with the images that Ving shared, and as a projection of power. And I was in Hong Kong between 2012 and the end of 2016, and I didn't see that power. In reverse, what I saw was sponsorship opportunities, fundraising drives. I saw marketing, and in a way, I was wondering how those ideas perhaps are sculpted and shaped, or and how much of that is intrinsic or into the shape of a particular project or an exhibition. So the scale of that Henry Moore that you just outlined for us as to that, but similarly the scale of the project with Anthony Gormley, which was taking multiple skyscrapers, loads of permissions. So there had to be lots of machines whirling to actually also make that possible. And then thinking about the differences between what those machines were, government versus private, and what their purpose were. So no, I mean it was sort of rumination, and I just wondered. Sorry, it was whether you may have a view on it, or that may be a contemporary a counterpoint to think about with Moore.
But I also think that even if Gormley's scale, it's also all over Hong Kong, but a part of that 1986 exhibition, the power of those monumental sculpture also is from the documentary. I mean, the images that they gather all of these movements together in a time-based element. And yeah, I think documentary is where that narrative is really formed, apart from the actual moment that the objects were there.
And is your point also that the documentary was being made, well still it was, so RTHK was still part of the imperial machinery at that time. So the documentary itself was an extension of that power or that framing for a project like that.
I actually tried to find is there a funding source behind that documentary? But there's no information about that. RTHK's position is that it's both attached to the colonial government, but it also had its own voice. And then I think in this documentary, you can see a part of it definitely attached to the colonial view, but there was a break point where I didn't spend too much time on it. That is when the local people, they saw those sculptures and give their honest feedback, and that's when the second narrative come out.
That's really interesting. Thank you. And I just wanted to close by reading out an interesting comment, actually, that's just come in via the Q&A from Annabella Pollen, who I believe it was Emma referenced earlier, who observes that the British Council's exhibitions of Moore have taken place in almost every year of its existence and traveled to almost every country that the British Council's worked in. His work is read differently in every place and at every time. By 1986, he was such a blue chip artist that there's a particular status to his work that was very different from how it was viewed in, say, Eastern Bloc locations in the Cold War. Same work and artist, but different meaning, message, and reception. I think we can sort of end on the note of, sort of not just Moore, but sort of that Britishness, it's, that he comes to represent itself, looking different and being received differently in different places. So thank you so much. I'm going to draw a couple of conclusions and hand back over to Maud quickly. So thank you so much to Roger, Francis, Emma, Abbas, Zara, and Wing for your amazing contributions and being so game for opening up what is an enormous question around what types of British art travel. Thank you also to all of the attendees for coming along, for asking really great questions and your contributions in the chat and the Q&A. I'm sorry if we didn't get to answer everybody's question, but I'm sure that, or I hope that lots of them will sort of follow us through the thread next week. And finally, thank you to Lynn Fine at UAL, who's provided us with stellar tech support, which is invaluable, as we all know. So I'm just going to hand over to Hammad, who will close this for today.
Well, thank you. I mean, and very, very quickly, I think just to thank you all for participating, my wonderful co-conveners, and to remind you that we have the third of our questions is live. And if anything, where we are ending the second workshop, on those questions of power and projection and how they shift and shape. I think that's very much a conversation that we will pick up in the next workshop on the 5th of May. Do be too mindful that it's not going to be at 2 p.m. as we have been up till now. It's going to be 10 a.m. London time. And part of that is also to allow for one of our participants who's joining in from Singapore. And that perhaps will give you a clue as to what narratives of British art are being co-produced internationally. So who gets to write these histories, especially if we do start accounting for them in the ways that Marlene and Abbas and the panel's been sort of talking about today, as being sort of foregrounding those migratory aspects of Britishness. So hope we'll see many of you next week, and thank you once again for this wonderful discussion.